improper maintenance caused the Airbus A330 to run out of fuel.
It began as a routine overnight flight across the Atlantic. On August 24, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 lifted off from Toronto, carrying 306 people bound for Lisbon. For 5 quiet hours, everything worked perfectly until a strange warning appeared on the cockpit screen. Moments later, the lights flickered, the engines coughed, and silence filled the cabin. At 39,000 feet, the world outside was nothing but darkness and cold air, and the pilots realized they were gliding without power over the middle of the ocean. This was more than an accident. It was a sign that the system itself was under strain. Five hours into the flight, everything on board, Air Transat 236 looked calm. The passengers were asleep, the cabin lights were dim, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly below. Then, inside the cockpit, a strange message flashed across the screen. Oil temperature low, oil pressure high. It made no sense. The readings completely contradicted each other. Captain Robert Pichet and his young first officer, Dirk de Jager, double-checked the manuals but found nothing that explained the warning. But just moments after liftoff, fire erupted from the left engine. After all, the Airbus A330 was one of the most advanced planes ever built, controlled by hundreds of digital sensors. Video footage confirmed what they saw: the fire started before the wheels even left the ground. That meant the failure had already begun while the plane was still speeding down. During a recent maintenance job, a replacement engine had been installed using parts that didn't perfectly fit. 2 pipes, one carrying fuel, the other hydraulic fluid, were rubbing against each other. For 5 days, vibration and pressure had worn them down until the larger fuel line cracked open, creating a leak invisible to the human eye. Now, thousands of pounds of jet fuel were pouring out into the night sky, leaving a thin, ghostly trail behind the plane. At first, there were no visible signs of danger. The passengers continued their movies and meals, unaware that the aircraft was slowly bleeding fuel. In the cockpit, the gauges still looked fine, except for one new alert: fuel imbalance. Suddenly, the burning engine detached completely from the wing. Following the Airbus procedure, the pilots opened the crossfeed valve, a system that allows fuel to flow between wings to balance weight. It seemed like the logical step, but it was the deadliest mistake of the night. Because the leak was on the right side, opening the valve only made things worse. The fuel from the left wing now rushed toward the right, flowing straight through the broken pipe and into the air. Within minutes, the plane had lost nearly all its remaining fuel, yet the crew still believed they were dealing with faulty readings. "It has to be a computer issue," Pichet said, but every second that passed was pushing them closer to disaster. As the minutes ticked away, the digital numbers began to fall faster than they could comprehend. The right tank was nearly empty, the center tank was low, and the gauges showed impossible values. They tried recalculating, checking for frost or sensor errors, but nothing matched reality. Somewhere, deep in their instincts, they both began to feel a quiet fear, the kind that creeps in when logic can no longer explain what is happening. The situation was turning from confusion to crisis. If they couldn't confirm a leak soon, the engines would fail. And in the middle of the Atlantic, there was no place to land. Pichet finally turned to his first officer and said, "We're missing something." But what were they missing? And how long before the silence of the ocean swallowed the sound of their engines for good? The first engine failed without warning. A sharp vibration ran through the aircraft, followed by a strange silence that filled every corner of the cabin. For a moment, Captain Pichet and First Officer de Jager exchanged glances, waiting for the familiar roar to return. It didn't. The right engine was gone. The only sound left came from the wind pressing against the body of the plane as it began to lose altitude. They tried transferring fuel from the center tank, hoping the gauges were wrong, but the numbers kept dropping. "We're losing number 1 too," de Jager said quietly. Seconds later, the second engine shut down, and both men realized what had just happened. The world's most advanced twin-engine airliner had become a silent glider drifting over the Atlantic. Inside the cabin, the sudden quiet felt unnatural. Passengers looked up from their seats, confused by the change in sound. A few whispered to each other, thinking it might be turbulence. Then the lights began to flicker, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The MD-11F, loaded with 38,000 gallons of jet fuel, slammed into a cluster of warehouses and parking lots near the airport. One flight attendant rushed down the aisle, shouting instructions, her voice trembling but steady. "Brace! Everyone, brace for impact!" In the cockpit, Pichet's training took over. He switched on the emergency checklist and tried to restart the engines, but the attempt failed. Without fuel, there was nothing to ignite. The A330's heavy frame was gliding at nearly 500 miles per hour, losing about 2,000 feet per minute. The only system still working was a small device called the ram air turbine, a tiny propeller that dropped from beneath the fuselage. It spun wildly in the rushing air, providing just enough power to move the flight controls and a few basic instruments. For Pichet, it was like steering a massive ship through fog, with only a candle for light. They calculated that from 39,000 feet, they could glide about 65 to 70 miles before hitting the ocean. The nearest land was the Azores Islands, roughly 80 miles away. They were short. Every foot of altitude now mattered. The captain adjusted the pitch, trading speed for distance, trying to stretch the glide as far as physics would allow. In those moments, the cockpit was filled with tension but also focus. Both pilots knew that panic would kill faster than gravity. "Let's keep calm," Pichet said softly. "We might still make it." As the minutes passed, the temperature dropped, frost began forming on the windows, and the cabin pressure started to fall. Passengers were told to put on life jackets and prepare for a possible water landing. Some prayed, others cried, and a few simply stared out the windows at the endless Black Sea. The plane was dying slowly but gracefully, slicing through the night like a wounded bird that refused to fall. In the middle of that silence, Pichet stared at his instruments and whispered, "We still have control." He tightened his grip on the yoke, watching the distant stars above the horizon. If they could glide just a few more miles, maybe, just maybe, they would see the first light of the Azores. But could instinct alone carry them that far, or would the Atlantic claim yet another secret beneath its waves? Captain Robert Pichet had flown through freezing storms in northern Quebec, but nothing had prepared him for this. At 30,000 feet, over a silent Atlantic, his engines were dead, and every decision now meant the difference between life and death. He gripped the controls tightly, feeling the plane respond only slightly to his commands. The stars above were the only fixed points left to guide him. The Airbus A330, once full of power, now glided through the night with no sound except the rush of air and the quiet heartbeat of its pilot. Yet in that silence, something strange happened. His fear faded, replaced by a deep, unexplainable calm. Pichet later said it felt as if someone else was guiding the aircraft. It was not superstition, but instinct that ancient sense pilots describe when training no longer matters and intuition takes control. He trusted that feeling completely. The navigation screens were nearly blank, and the autopilot was gone. The only help came from the faint glow of a compass and the soft spinning of the emergency turbine. Whatever the reason, the timing could not have been worse. At this rate, they had just over 15 minutes before they hit the ocean. Working together in near darkness, the two men adjusted their glide path toward the Azores. It was a tiny chain of islands in the middle of nowhere, but their only chance of survival. Pichet's hands moved steadily, keeping the descent smooth to preserve altitude. Every time he touched the controls, the plane felt heavier, slower, closer to the limits of gravity. The silence was both terrifying and beautiful, a moment when time seemed to stop, and the only thing that existed was the steady rhythm of control. Below them, passengers were praying, holding hands, whispering the names of loved ones. In the cockpit, Pichet's breathing slowed. He was no longer thinking about procedures or manuals. It left a dark gap between what the crew experienced and what the world outside understood. That gap forced the National Transportation Safety Board to rely entirely on data logs, radar readings, and witness accounts. They passed through thin layers of cloud, and the airspeed began to drop dangerously low. De Jager called out numbers, his tone urgent. The captain responded with small corrections, keeping the nose of the aircraft just above the stall point. The distance to land was shrinking, but not fast enough. They needed to see lights, any sign of the island. The radar was nearly useless, and the radio static grew louder. Then, faintly, a message broke through. "Air Transat 236, we have you on primary radar. Confirm heading to Lajas Field." That single transmission meant hope. Somewhere out there, the Azores were waiting. Pichet pressed forward, following a feeling more than a direction. He didn't know if it was experience, instinct, or something beyond reason, but he trusted it completely. And as the first faint glow appeared on the horizon, one question filled his mind. Was it land, or just another illusion in the endless dark? Through the fog and the endless dark, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. It was weak, almost invisible, but to Captain Pichet and First Officer De Jager, it was everything. Those tiny dots of light marked the runway of Lajas Air Base, the only patch of land between them and the ocean. The instruments were still unreliable, but their eyes didn't lie. They were less than 10 miles out, gliding in complete silence. The crew's voices were steady but tense. "Gear down," Pichet said. The hydraulics groaned as the landing gear locked in place. There would be no second attempt. They had one shot to get it right. Inside the cabin, fear had turned to fragile hope. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, searching for what the pilots saw. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared ahead, too exhausted to think. The plane was moving too fast. Without engines, they couldn't use thrust reversers or spoilers to slow down. Their only options were gravity, wind, and skill. The airspeed climbed past 200 knots. The captain's hands stayed firm on the controls. "Too fast," De Jager warned. "I know," Pichet replied. "But we're not missing this runway." As the ground drew closer, the runway lights flickered through the mist. The aircraft's nose trembled as it fought to stay level. The pilots could feel the weight shifting, the drag changing, the fragile balance between lift and collapse. Then came the first hard impact. The plane hit the ground at over 200 knots, faster than any safe landing speed. The MD-11 was built to last, but nothing lasts forever in aviation. Sparks flashed beneath the wings, and for a few seconds, it looked as if the entire jet might break apart. But Pichet held the nose steady, guiding the aircraft straight down the center line. The passengers screamed, the oxygen mask swung wildly, and metal scraped against asphalt in a storm of sparks. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound changed. The grinding slowed. The lights outside stopped moving. The plane had come to a stop right in the middle of the runway. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then a cry rose from the cabin, followed by applause, laughter, and sobs. Cargo airlines like UPS operate differently from passenger carriers. Their business runs on speed, precision, and volume. At the company's Worldport hub in Louisville, a new plane lands every minute during the night shift. The Airbus A330 had landed safely after flying more than 70 miles without power, the longest glide ever recorded in passenger aviation history. Every soul on board survived. Yet as rescue crews arrived, one thought lingered in the captain's mind. They had defied physics, survived the impossible, and touched down against every odd. But what if that light on the horizon had never appeared? Each inspection can take days, but tight schedules often force airlines to plan shorter maintenance windows. The runway was littered with tire fragments, scrape marks, and burned rubber. The Airbus A330 stood silent, its engines dark and empty, as if the entire aircraft had aged 100 years overnight. What had forced one of the most advanced planes in the world to glide across the ocean with no power? The investigation that followed would uncover a chain of mistakes, tiny errors that built into a disaster only avoided by human instinct. The first clue came from the fuel system. Every tank on the plane was bone dry. Yet the flight log showed that the aircraft had left Toronto with over 47 tons of fuel, more than enough to reach Lisbon. Somewhere over the Atlantic, that fuel had vanished. Engineers began tracing the fuel lines, searching for leaks or mechanical damage. Near the right engine, they found the truth. A small section of the fuel pipe had rubbed against a hydraulic line until both wore through. The leak had started there, releasing thousands of gallons of jet fuel into the night sky. But how could such a failure happen on a jet that passed every safety check? Were the fatigue checks thorough, or were some areas skipped? 5 days before the flight, Air Transat had replaced the right-hand engine with one sent by Rolls-Royce. The replacement came without a crucial support bracket and a set of tubes designed to prevent contact between the pipes. The mechanics, unaware of the incompatibility, reused parts from an older engine that didn't fit perfectly. The clearance between the tubes was off by just a few millimeters. That tiny difference was enough to cause friction, vibration, and eventually a rupture. When investigators questioned the maintenance crew, one technician admitted that he had expressed concern before the flight. He had told his supervisor that the parts didn't match exactly, but the reply was simple: "We can't afford to delay." The company was under pressure to keep its aircraft flying. Waiting for the correct part would have grounded the jet for days and cost thousands of dollars. So they took the risk and nearly lost 306 lives. Air Transat accepted full responsibility, paying a record fine of $250,000 Canadian dollars. Schools in Jefferson County were closed the following day, not because of physical damage, but because the city was in mourning. Airbus revised its fuel management procedures, adding new warnings to detect leaks faster. But for many in the aviation world, the most unsettling discovery wasn't mechanical at all. It was how easily trust in technology had blinded the crew. The systems were perfect, but the people behind them weren't. The miracle of Flight 236 wasn't just survival. It was proof that instinct could still save lives when machines failed. But as the investigators closed their reports, one question lingered. In an age built on automation, how long before another pilot has to choose between trusting the system or trusting himself? In the months that followed, the world called it the miracle on the Atlantic. News stations replayed the landing footage over and over, and headlines praised Captain Robert Pichet as a hero. The mayor called it the darkest day in Louisville's modern history. The story of Flight 236 was not just about survival. It was about the thin line between control and chaos, between data and instinct. It became a reminder that even in the age of automation, human intuition still mattered. Could the disaster have been prevented before that night? Reporters waited outside his house, and television shows wanted interviews. But the captain avoided the spotlight. He often said that what happened over the Atlantic wasn't heroism, just duty. The investigation into Flight 2976 began before the fire was even out. One passenger recalled, "When the engine stopped, I thought it was the end, but his calm voice on the intercom made me believe we might survive." That calmness, steady, grounded, almost fatherly, became the reason 306 people walked away alive. Air Transat used the incident to rebuild its reputation. The airline introduced stricter safety checks, new pilot training programs, and transparent maintenance reports. Airbus engineers redesigned parts of the fuel monitoring system to prevent false readings. Across the industry, Flight 236 became a case study. Pilots around the world studied Pichet's glide, his decision-making, and his ability to stay composed under unimaginable pressure. Many said that the event reminded them of something aviation had forgotten. Technology is only as good as the human who commands it. But there was another side to the story, the human cost of survival. After the landing, Pichet struggled with the weight of what had happened. He carried guilt for believing the early warnings were computer errors, even though the investigation cleared him of wrongdoing. He began drinking heavily and avoided flying for months. Later, he spoke openly about it, saying, "People called me a hero, but heroes don't have nightmares." His honesty struck a chord with many pilots who had faced near disasters. It showed that even the strongest professionals could be haunted by moments when luck and instinct replaced logic. Over time, Pichet returned to the skies, calmer and wiser. He said the experience taught him humility, the understanding that no pilot, no matter how skilled, is ever fully in control. "The plane decides what it can do," he said once. "We just guide it." His words turned into a quiet philosophy about aviation, one that valued respect over mastery. Today, more than 2 decades later, the legacy of Flight 236 continues to echo. It's not just a lesson in aerodynamics or safety procedures. It's a story about faith in skill, in teamwork, and sometimes in something greater than ourselves. Because in that silent sky above the Atlantic, something more than physics kept them alive. But what was it, pure luck, divine intervention, or the unshakable spirit of one man refusing to let go? UPS Flight 2976 lasted less than a minute in the air, but its impact will echo for years. It turned into a symbol of human resilience, the triumph of instinct over failure, and the quiet mystery of what some called divine intervention. Aviation schools around the world began teaching the Pichet glide as a model of crisis management. Students learned not only about aerodynamics and checklists, but about courage, teamwork, and calm under pressure. For them, the flight was a reminder that sometimes survival depends not on data or machines, but on the human heart's refusal to give up. Yet the story also revealed the hidden fragility of modern flight. The Airbus A330 was a masterpiece of engineering, powered by advanced computers and sensors. It could predict turbulence, detect wind shifts, and balance fuel automatically. But that night, one small maintenance error and one human assumption almost brought it all down. The event forced airlines to face a simple truth: progress can make us safer, but it can also make us complacent. Every technological leap demands greater responsibility, not less. For the passengers, life after the landing was never the same. Many spoke of recurring nightmares, the silence before impact, the shaking cabin, the smell of smoke. Some couldn't board another plane for years. Others, however, saw the experience as a second chance. One survivor said, "When the engine stopped, I thought I was dead. But when we touched the ground, I realized I had been given another life." Those words spread widely, turning Flight 236 into something larger than an accident, a story about how fragile and precious existence truly is. Captain Pichet eventually wrote a memoir, sharing his version of that night. He spoke about fear, faith, and the strange peace that came when all systems failed. He described how, in the darkest moments, he felt as if an unseen force was guiding the aircraft, not a miracle, but something he called the invisible hand. His words fascinated readers and inspired debates among scientists, pilots, and believers alike. Was it intuition, experience, or something beyond understanding? The legacy of Flight 236 stretched beyond aviation. It became a metaphor for life itself, how people navigate chaos when logic collapses, how trust can bridge the gap between despair and survival. For years, filmmakers and journalists returned to the Azores to capture that lonely runway where everything changed. Even today, tourists visit the site, standing on the tarmac and imagining what it must have felt like to fall from the sky and live. The wreckage was cleared long ago, but the story remains. It whispers a warning and a promise that technology will always advance, but the spirit behind the controls will decide its fate. Because at 39,000 feet, when the machines fail and the sky falls silent, what truly saves us is not the system we built, but the courage to keep flying through the dark. More than 20 years later, Flight 236 still feels like a message written across the sky. It tells us that even in a world ruled by machines, the human spirit remains the final safeguard. Captain Pichet's calm, his instinct, and his faith turned an impossible fall into a second chance for 306 lives. The Atlantic kept its silence, but that night, humanity spoke louder. What if courage itself was the invisible hand guiding them home? If you believe some miracles are made by human will, not luck, leave your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind survival.